Good morning, everybody. Please take a seat. Okay, so this is our third lesson on this topic about chapter 4 of The Way to Buddhahood. So again, what I've presented on the screen now is the very high level structure of this chapter, and we've covered part 1, the foundation of the three vehicle path, and the main point to stress there is to develop the aspiration to leave samsara, to gain liberation. Now, building on that, we have part 2, which basically covers the details of the different audience and the key doctrines, which is the subject. And then following that is the practice, the methods that will help one to realize their aspirations to leave samsara. And then finally, the results, which is an explanation of what liberation is, what is that goal, and so forth. So this is the overall very high level structure. Some of the details when we study at Buddhist college, this structure is actually there are many more sub-levels to go into details, but for now I think it's easier just to let you understand the overall structure of this particular chapter. And a thing to note about the subject, practice and result, this is actually a very common way to split a certain teaching. So you might want to keep that in mind for when you're reading a different sutra or a different Dharma text. This is a very common set, looking at the subject. So what is this sutra I'm reading? What is this Dharma text I'm reading? What is the subject, the target audience, the main topic, the main doctrines? And then how does that theory transfer into practice? What is this book teaching me about in terms of the practical aspects? And what are the results I can expect if I follow these practices and so forth? So I'm not sure how much exposure you have to reading sutras, but the sutras, if you think about it, were taught by the Buddha to audiences as the situation arose. So they're very much spontaneous teachings coming out from the Buddha's wisdom. They're not like a prepared and structured, thought out thesis or lecture series where we think, okay, the introduction, the body, how do we split up the body in logical sequential segments and so forth. So that's why when we read the sutras, you can bear in mind the subject, practice and results, and you can pick out the details in the text and see whether it fits into one of these categories. That might actually help you to sort and rearrange some of the texts you're reading if you find that text a bit, haphazard and jumbled up and so forth. Okay, so having covered all that, let's continue with where we left off yesterday. So yesterday we were talking about, we ended up in the section about faith inclined and wisdom inclined, and that is still a discussion on the different groups and categories of disciples among the Shravaka practitioners. So now we come to the next half verse. And the verse says, though there are many different spiritual foundations, all can cultivate the transcendental path. So far, what we have discussed yesterday are the various characteristics of the people who aspire to end cyclic existence. And because of these characteristics, we group them as Shravaka practitioners, Pratyeka Buddha practitioners, and Bodhisattva practitioners. So that's based on their aspiration. Another way of categorizing people who want to end cyclic existence is in terms of householder or monastic practitioners. And this is based on their personality and the lifestyle they prefer to live, whether it be more towards the ascetic, stricter, self-restrained lifestyle, or in a more communal setting, and so forth. So all these relate to the practitioner's characteristics, personal characteristics. So the way we group all of these disciples is a way to help us understand, well, what type of practice is more suited to them. Now, although there are these many different spiritual foundations and they lead to the manifestation of these different characteristics in groups, as long as a practitioner aspires to end cyclic existence, then they all can cultivate the transcendental path and reach the final goal of ending birth and death. Now, often people use their own personality or personal preferences to judge everything else. And this is human nature, basically. Is that a hand up? Oh, sorry. I thought you wanted to ask a question. Okay, sorry. So, from this habitual behavior, because we're all quite subjective, we go from our personal thinking and so forth. Often we don't realize it, and this also applies when we learn the Dharma as well. So when we say that we're a Shravaka practitioner or I'm a Bodhisattva practitioner and so forth, at times we need to be careful with what type of image we're projecting, whether we're just simply stating, oh, my personal preference, I like these practices, or if we're unintentionally giving people the idea that, oh, I am better because I am a Sravakayana practitioner. What are you? So these are little, personal habits that we have accumulated over the years and ages, and we need to be aware of that. So when we split up all these different, subgroups of disciples, it's not to say which is better or worse. It's to help us identify personally, what are my personal preferences, and therefore which group is more likely suited to help me progress in my path. And projecting that out, if you have friends, you need to understand what are their personal characteristics like, and therefore what is the better choice to advise them. Perhaps you're actually more suited to the Bodhisattva path rather than the Shravaka path, and so forth. Okay, but at times, sadly, due to having these biases, some people who perhaps are more faith inclined consider themselves to have a stronger spiritual foundation. And in return, they consider those who are wisdom inclined to be overemphasizing the Dharma and investigating the Dharma. And they think that these people are just bookworms. They don't actually study, unlike me. So some people do have that type of misconception when they see these things. And again, that's, a result of personal biases. And at times you have the opposite, you have the wisdom inclined practitioners who think, well, I know the Dharma so well, I can memorize this sutra and that sutra, whereas those who are faith inclined only know to bow in front of the Buddha and so forth. So at times you may come across this situation where people do compare and think, one group is better than the other. So, and remember we were talking about the forest dwelling and the communal monks as well. So you have a similar situation where forest-dwelling monks focus on practice, practice, practice. And then they will think, oh, the communal monks are chatterbox. You know, they're not focusing enough on their meditation. They need to quiet down. And vice versa, the communal monks are saying, those people only sit under a tree and they don't care about all the other people in suffering. They're not helping spreading the Dharma. We're pulling up the burden and so forth. So with all of these differences, you know, they do occur, and you do see these, when you read the sutras, you do see these types of behavior and attitude come up. But during the Buddha's time, it's unrefutable that there was a preference because of, I guess, you know, the spiritual and cultural situation of ancient India. There was a preference towards the monastic lifestyle because people did think that if you're serious about your spiritual practice, then, you know, you follow the Shramana path. And that's why many chose the monastic lifestyle, regardless of whether they were actually suited to it or not. So that's a lesson for us to learn, is that it's important for us to recognize what are the different groups and why are there these differences, and then think, well, these are just ways to help people enter the path and move along in the path. But their differences should not be a sticking point for us to create further unnecessary discrimination, particularly within the Buddhist community. And importantly, you know, we should understand that anyone who practices and studies the Buddha Dharma, we all have our different spiritual foundations, and our foundations change as we progress. So, and as we progress, so too our preferences will also begin to change as well. So up until now, we've looked at the different types of practitioners within the three vehicle path. And now we move to the object. And that is the object that these practitioners focus on. And this namely is the fundamental doctrines or principles that underlie their practice. So first, let us canvass the overall outline of the transcendental practices of the three vehicles. And then we'll look at the practices taught by the Buddha, though they cater to the different spiritual foundations. And so there are many, many practices. But when they're categorized all together, then these teachings on the path to liberation can be grouped under the doctrines of the Four Noble Truths and dependent co-arising. So practices that depart from these two main doctrines cannot be considered as transcendental Buddha Dharma teachings. And truth here means to be not upside down, not to be confused and muddled, which also means to be true and correct. And here, this verse says, the Buddha's teachings on the path to liberation is the Four Noble Truths and dependent co-arising. The profound Mahayana doctrines of the Buddha Dharma is revealed through these two main doctrines. Okay. So the transcendental teachings of the Buddha are based on the Four Noble Truths concerning suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path leading to cessation. Now, these four rightly reveal the specific nature of human existence and this world. Now, this is what we would refer to as the noble truth of suffering. And this teaching also reveals the causes leading to the suffering and afflictions in this world, which is covered in the noble truth on the cause. Now, these four also explain the state of transcending the world where all suffering is eliminated, and that's covered in the noble truth of cessation. And then the method to end suffering is covered in the noble truth of the path. Now, the Buddha primarily uses the Four Noble Truths to explain his transcendental teachings. And the accomplishment of the Buddha Dharma requires both faith and wisdom. Simply having absolute faith will not be enough to attain liberation. We must clearly and properly understand the nature of suffering, that is, human existence, and know the causes leading to these sufferings. Only then can we experience the truth and attain liberation through the process of ending suffering. Then we will no longer endure the suffering and the endless rounds of rebirth in this world. So with respect to dependent co-arising, this teaching is not distinct from the Four Noble Truths. They're connected. When one investigates the fact of suffering after repeated inference and seeking out the origins of suffering, one will realize that between the cause and the result of suffering, there is this natural law of mutual dependence and arising. Now, this law is namely that ignorance conditions volition, volition conditions consciousness, consciousness conditions name and form. Now, name and form here can also be understood as the body and mind. And name and form then conditions the six sense faculties and so on. So hopefully by now you should realize that this is referring to the 12 links of dependent origination. Now, this is the signature teaching of the 12 links that the Buddha presented. And in essence, these links are the sequential teachings concerning suffering and its cause. So dependent co-arising teaches us that these aspects or these links, suffering and its cause, etc., are all reliant on conditions in order to come to be. Therefore, it is possible to eliminate suffering and attain liberation by changing the causes and conditions that lead to suffering. And this is reflected in the two truths of cessation and the path leading to cessation. Consequently, the following discussion will adopt the Four Noble Truths as the overall outline to explain the same concept of dependent co-arising. So the material that I'm going to cover here will also be related to Venerable Tangzi's talk on the law of dependent co-arising. So hopefully what I've presented here will be reinforced at different angles from Venerable Tangzi's talk. And then hopefully by the end of the retreat, you'll all be very well versed in the law of dependent co-arising. So ordinarily, people think that the Four Noble Truths and dependent co-arising purely belong to the Sravakayana teachings. But little do they realize that the Mahayana's profound doctrines that permeate everything are also revealed through the Four Noble Truths and dependent co-arising. So we want to stress that the Four Noble Truths, dependent co-arising, are fundamental Buddhist teachings and Buddhist principles. They're not purely just for the Theravada's teachings. They're not purely just the Mahayana teachings. So they're fundamental Buddhist teachings. Now, in terms of emphasis, in the Sravakayana, there is a stronger focus on explaining the truths of suffering and its cause, while in the Mahayana, there tends to be an emphasis, an inclination towards the truth of cessation and the path leading to cessation. And in particular, there is a greater focus on explaining the states of cessation. So if you read a lot of the Mahayana sutras, there are a lot of questions from people. The sutra will say someone asked, someone questioned, and it's always about what is this state of liberation and so forth. And there are the Mahayana sutras do try and give more explanation to help people understand. Whereas within the Nikayas and the Agamas, when people ask the Buddha about what is nirvana, often he would give very simple answers, but he would avoid explaining too much because he didn't want people to then become attached to these descriptions, because the state of nirvana is beyond description, is beyond language. So he can only give so much of guidance, and he also wants to avoid creating unnecessary attachment as well. So we can see these differences in the teachings of the Madhyamaka and Yogacara schools. So the Madhyamaka and Yogacara schools are Mahayana schools. And, you know, hopefully you'll remember from Venerable Tangtze's teachings over the last few years, which he covered in detail. The Madhyamaka teachings emphasize emptiness, while the Yogacara teachings, or the consciousness-only school, they tend to emphasize conditional existence. So they focus a lot on explaining the causes and conditions, whereas the Prajna teachings, the Madhyamaka teachings, they go direct to emptiness. And both of these teachings, both of these schools, their teachings do not depart from the doctrines of the Four Noble Truths and dependent co-arising. So this point is quite clearly captured in the Sutra on the Lion's Roar of Queen Shramala, which summarizes that Shravakayana presents the Four Noble Truths in a way where it is measurable and tangible, and the Mahayana presents the Four Noble Truths in a way where it is immeasurable and intangible. So again, the focus here is the Four Noble Truths, dependent co-arising, crosses both Theravada and Mahayana teachings. The Shravakayana and Mahayana practitioners all learn from it if they want transcendence. So here's another example from the Mahayana Paranirvana Sutra, which says, those with weaker wisdom investigate dependent co-arising and attain the awakening of the Shravakas. Those with the most superior wisdom investigate dependent co-arising and attain the awakening of the Buddhas. So the Buddha Dharma never departs from the doctrines of the Four Noble Truths and dependent co-arising. And any difference that we see is merely due to whether one attains partial or full awakening, and whether the teachings are presented as an introductory or as a more advanced levels. So here we have another half verse, and it says, suffering and its cause, cessation and the path. So that first line covers the Four Noble Truths. These are the Four Noble Truths. So this next verse, this next half verse clearly states what are the Four Noble Truths. And the truths are suffering, its cause, cessation and the path. So these four are collectively referred to as the Four Noble Truths, or sometimes you'll see it as the Four Truths. In Chinese, there are many more different descriptors. English, I think, is a bit easier. We're quite consistent with the way we term these, these aspects. Now, everyone experiences suffering, and the cause of this suffering is effectively defilements or afflictions, vexations, depending on the readings and translations you see. So, why would the sutras emphasize these Four Noble Truths? Now, in terms of the reality of the world we live in, suffering refers to the unsatisfactory pressures that is a fact of our human existence in this world. Now, cause refers to the defilements and the karmic forces that arise because of defilements. Cessation refers to the state where all defilements are eliminated and can no longer give rise to suffering. The path refers to morality, meditative concentration, and wisdom, which are the virtues that counteract defilements and allow us to clearly understand the practices that lead to nirvana. So only the sages are able to personally experience and understand these truths through worldly matters and then attain true awakening and insight into these truths. So these truths here are still confined within language. We're trying to explain it to you. But when you practice and realize it, it's actually a personal experience. Okay, so when you experience nirvana, when you experience liberation, then you'll be able to further confirm for yourself, this really is suffering. This is the cause. This is the cessation, and I have practiced the path and so forth. So at that time, that's when your experience confirms for you that these really are noble truths. So again, we have another quote from the Mahayana Parinibbana Sutra. So the reason why I've got Mahayana there is within the Theravada Tripitaka, there's also a Parinibbana Sutra, and that's different. So the quote here comes from the Mahayana Parinibbana Sutra. And it says, ordinary people know there is suffering, but do not know the noble truths, while sages know there is suffering and the truth of suffering. Okay. And again, in the Sutra on the Buddha's last discourse, there is this following quote. The Buddha's teaching on the truth of suffering is about true suffering that cannot be turned into happiness. Its cause is about the true cause, and there are no other causes. When suffering ends, that means the cause have been eliminated. When the cause is eliminated, the results are eliminated. The path leading to the end of suffering is the true path, and there is no other path. So this captures the Four Noble Truths, and this was, the final teaching that the Buddha gave prior to entering parinirvana. So this sutra, the Buddha's last discourse, is what the Buddha taught the disciples just prior to him entering parinirvana and leaving this world. So concerning the nature of suffering, that is the trademark of human existence and this world, the nature of defilement that causes accumulation, the nature of nirvana, that is cessation, and the nature of morality, meditative concentration, and wisdom, these all are indications that help us to move towards nirvana. They can lead us to nirvana if we understand them clearly and properly. So that's why they're called truths. They're truths, they're inevitable, and they're absolute. And when one deeply understands and experiences these truths, one then becomes a sage themselves. Now, sages are free from any doubts concerning these truths, and hence these truths are called the Four Noble Truths. So this is a bit of an explanation on why they are called truths and why we then add the adjective of noble. So noble is an adjective to describe the people who have fully realized these truths. Okay? and we refer to them as sages. So in Buddhism, when we talk about a sage, it means they have attained some level of awakening towards these truths, whether it's partial or full. So on the topic of the Four Noble Truths, let us begin with the truth of suffering. Now, this relates to the factual situation of our bodies and minds and the situation in this world. And it's something that we first need to understand and realize. So suffering has the meaning of pressure and irritation. Namely, the body and the mind is subject to pressures that then causes ourselves to be irritated and unsettled. The Buddha once explained the many different types of sufferings, but in terms of human beings, the main types are the 8 sufferings, which are captured in this next verse. Suffering includes not getting what one wants, meeting with enemies, and separation from loved ones, birth, aging, illness, and death. These are due to the 5 aggregates. So this verse captures the 8 types of suffering. Okay. So the first aspect of the 8 types of suffering is not getting what one wants. Now, this can be referring to reputation, power, family, wealth, and so forth. So these are the things that human beings ordinarily long for and desire after. And yet, very often, or at certain times, they'll be out of our reach. So desiring something and not being able to attain it is a kind of suffering. In addition, having something or finally getting that thing that you desire, you then face the suffering of, I don't want to lose it. So you then have the problem of, how can I protect it? How can I preserve it? And then when you lose it, the suffering snowballs. So these are all types of suffering that are classed under not getting what one wants. So the sutra says, when our desires are not fulfilled, the vexation is like being shot by an arrow. And this is the suffering of not getting what one wants. So this suffering arises due to our relationship with external things, external matters. Okay, so these 8 types of suffering are sufferings that come about because of our relationship with certain things. Now, the second of the 8 is the suffering of meeting with those we dislike. And then you have number 3, which is the reverse, and that's the suffering of being separated from loved ones. So these 2 kind of sufferings arise due to our relationship with society and other people or other, our pets and so forth as well. Given today's society, we can extend that to other animate objects as such. So basically it's suffering due to our relationships in a nutshell. And towards those we disagree with, those which we have mutual resentment or hatred for, we don't see eye to eye. And when they're not in front of us, everything is fine. But there are situations in life where sometimes we will meet with them, and even worse, we have to work with them, and we can't avoid associating with them. You know, it may be the annoying aunt, or it may be the annoying, receptionist at work or so forth. But at times we're caught in situations where we cannot avoid having to interact with people we don't want to interact with. And so that is a form of suffering. And conversely, you have the other situation where your loved ones, your parents, your siblings, your partner, children, friends, and so forth. You don't want to be apart from them. And here the separation can be both mental and or physical. So for example, I myself, I don't live with my family. As monks and nuns, we tend to either live within the Sangha and are away from our family and friends. But just knowing that they're alive and they're happy and well, that connection is there. And so I'm not suffering. But when I hear so-and-so is sick, my little nephew is sick, or, mum's had a fall and broken her leg, that brings on suffering to me. So it's not simply just having to be, away, having to move out of the house and not be physically close to your family. So this suffering, the separation from loved ones, most of the time when you read this, people do think about separation in terms of death. But if you think about it in terms of your normal life, the habit, particularly for Westerners, is to move out of home when they're adults and enjoy their independence away from mum and dad. But knowing that mum and dad is safe and there when you want to give them a call, that's comforting. But, suffering arises when that ability or that knowledge that they're not safe, they're not well. So these are all suffering that arises from our relationship with others. Now we've got a little over 6 minutes left, so I'm trying to make sure I don't go over time and to also give you guys the opportunity to ask some questions. Yes, Jody?
Yes. So one of your slides you mentioned defilements. I know that Buddhism emphasizes the present, but would you say that due to karmic forces, some people are born with more defilements? Or is that a wrong way of thinking that?
Yes and no. So the way, if you look at the Yogacara teachings, they classify our defilements into many different subcategories. And so there's a teaching on the 100 dharmas, and that's 100 different types of dharmas. And within that, the mental activities are classed as 51 different types. We only think about greed, hatred, and ignorance as the three main, but those can then be subdivided into more subtle types. And what that means is every human being is capable of all these types of mental defilements. But because of past karmic habits, certain defilements may be stronger and certain defilements may be weaker. So that's why you can, in that regards, you can say, yes, some people are born in this life with more defilements because of their conditioning in the past. But I would say that's, in Buddhism, that's where you need to be careful not to fall into the so-called fixed fate theory. So this goes back to your question yesterday about the theories of fatalism and divine providence seeping into the Buddha Dharma. It's because people then kind of attach to that idea. He's born with more defilements, or she's born with better situations, and so forth. In Buddhism, we would say that that's all from causes and conditions. And it's just a temporary situation. So if you learn the Dharma, you can practice to dampen the unwholesome afflictions and focus on the virtues and so forth. Because ultimately, defilement does not necessarily refer to really bad emotions. So greed and hatred, yes, we would call defilement, but some people forget that love is also a defilement under the Buddhist definition. So because defilement here, you need to understand, is any mental activity that can create actions that then keep you stuck in samsara. So definitely, you know, the nasty and violent types of defilements such as envy, jealousy, rage, and so forth, which may then flow over into really bad actions of harming and so forth. And that creates a lot of bad karma. But like I was talking, you know, love and compassion, if it's too excessive and not guided by wisdom, that can create a lot of attachment as well. So defilement in the Buddhist sense is referring to the elements that keep us stuck in cyclic existence. Yeah. So some people, you know, from the aspect of if you take a snapshot in time, you could say, yes, some people are born with more defilements because of their past behavior. But if you go, you know, if you stretch that timeline further, then it'll depend on how they practice and whether you introduce them to the Dharma and therefore help them practice to, you know, weaken some of their stronger defilements and nurture more virtues and so forth. Yes.
My question is that Buddha's last discourse, it said that true suffering cannot turn into happiness. Suffering is not happiness.
Mm.
The message is malevolence. But in the ideal of happiness, when we have attained what we consider nirvana, isn't that going to be that ultimate happiness? We're not saying it's love, we're just saying bliss, happiness, whatever you want to call that attainment. Wouldn't it sometime appear?
Yes. So there's another, you know, description, whereas in the world there is impermanence, there is suffering, there is no true happiness. But once liberation is attained, then we have true and lasting bliss and serenity. They tend not to use happiness. I guess the main idea is to try and avoid people bringing the worldly concept of happiness to nirvana, whereas nirvana is considered still. They like to use the words calm, tranquil, still, and they use the description of waves in the ocean. So we've never left nirvana, but we're unable to experience it because of the defilements. And in the analogy, the defilements are like the winds that stir up all these waves on the ocean. And once those winds die down, once we start to tame our defilements and ultimately eliminate it, then the waves subside and the water level returns to stillness. Yeah.
Because it's an Eastern and a Western philosophy that I often find. One is always seeking happiness, and the other one says, let's just take it easy here, stay calm.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I often, because we live in a...
You might want to think of it as, you know, some people consider being happy as partying and raging at a disco. Others consider being happy, you know, in a nice, quiet library. So the Buddhist nirvana is more towards the library, as opposed to the Western happiness is more closer to the rave parties. Yeah. But I guess what we're saying, you know, taking that analogy, what do you get from spending time in the library? You gain peace, you gain knowledge, and you're safe. What do you gain with the happiness at a rave party? You have the dangers of, you know, getting drunk. You get the dangers of that comes with the rave parties, and you know, hangovers after that. So is that happiness lasting, as opposed to the happiness and the peace and comfort you get from spending a nice day in the library or the museum and so forth? You can leave there safely and bring back your experience. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? No? Okay. So we'll end the class today then. Okay. Thank you.